During the vast majority of the war, the RAF's irascible, argumentative, difficult and bloody-minded leader, Arthur Harris, had basically done whatever he wanted with his bombers. When America had entered the war, he looked at the 3 aircraft that they'd brought with them and the 25 awfully keen young men who'd flown them over, and inquired not entirely unkindly whether or not they were serious about committing some bizarre form of seppuku by flying in daylight. The Americans, being Americans, did not quite understand the question, and instead they asked, which way to Berlin? Harris, somewhat nonplussed by this, gave them all of his bases in Suffolk and Norfolk to allow for their short ranges, and shrugged, getting on with the important business of blowing German civilians into tiny little bits. Harris had always got on very well with his American opposite numbers, bonding with Arnold and Spaatz and Acre when he'd been posted to Washington. So when he saw how heavy their losses were and how minor the impact was that they were having, he went over and tried to press his case a little further, suggesting perhaps that they switched to night bombing. The Americans, by now very much less starry-eyed and naive than they once had been, did what they've often done in a hard fight. They got up off the mat, spat out a mouthful of teeth and blood, and raised their fists for the next round. By the middle of December 1943, it was clear that their plans were not working, and they could not continue to sustain the kinds of losses that they'd been taking indefinitely. Something would have to give. Nevertheless, despite the horrors of losing 30% of their entire force in just 2 raids in November and December, they were still in the fight and aiming to win it. Harris raised an eyebrow, touched the peak of his cap in respect, and tried to make sure that they got whatever they needed from his command to stay in the fight. Meanwhile, the invasion of Europe loomed. Even as the United States Army Air Forces in Europe gained muscle and became a serious contender in the bomber war, the impact that they were having was still marginal. The original objective, issued at Casablanca in January of 1943 to destroy the Luftwaffe and prepare the way for an invasion, had failed to have any discernible effect on either United States or RAF tactics. So the Joint Chiefs tried again in July, issuing something called the Point-Blank Directive, which rather bluntly told them to get the hell on with it. But by December of 1943, neither force had, in fact, got on with it, preferring their own preconceived ideas about how this air war should be fought. The ancient Chinese philosopher-soldier Sun Tzu is supposed to have died at the age of 47, which is somewhat discomforting to me, as it doesn't exactly give me a lot of time to get my magnus opus, Hard Thrasher's Guide to Making War and Not Dying in a Ditch, out into the consciousness of the world. However, I will give you, dear viewer, a sneak peek of lesson number 301. No, 301, that's not the one. That's the one about sniffing the seat of exercise bikes in the ladies' gym after dark. No, hang on here. Yes, lesson 103. Infantry do not like getting blown up by enemy aircraft. It is bad for their morale. Actually, most swaddies I've spoken to object to pretty much everything under all circumstances except having a quick brew. Nevertheless, near the top of the list of things that they really object to is indeed being blown up by the enemy air force. And Eisenhower did not require my book of tactics to know that this was true. He was, therefore, pretty keen, and by pretty keen I mean he threatened to resign over the matter, to make sure that Harris and Eaker stopped behaving like oversized children and actually got on with the job at hand. He needed them to defeat the German Air Force as quickly as he could in the run-up to the invasion, and not fanny around trying to get grandiose theories to work. Eisenhower also knew that he had to go through channels to make this happen, despite being le grand fromage in Europe. As the British and Americans shared joint command structures for Overlord and the US Army had bagged top spot, the British had got their man to run all things with wings to become Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, and they had selected a man called Arthur Tedder to do the job. This was a little bit tricky because, technically speaking, Tedder was outranked by both Hap Arnold in the United States Army Air Forces and, of course, Sir Charles Portal, Air Marshal of the Royal Air Force, and technically Tedder's boss. However, Tedder was not just a superb commander, he was also a gifted political operator with a track record of getting shit done. And he therefore turned round to both Arnold and Portal and said words to the effect of, "Get the f*** on with it." How they did that, and the process of how they won one of the most remarkable victories in the air war, will be our story today. Well, hello, welcome. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, owner of more of Lincolnshire than Bomber Command and possessor of a great deal more hair than Jimmy Doolittle. Before we kick off properly, a couple of quick parish notices. Firstly, a number of new subscribers have recently signed up, so a big hello to them. Thank you very much for coming. You are most welcome. Please do take a smoking jacket off the peg, pour yourself a little drink, and Jenkins will be through with sandwiches shortly. Secondly, please be aware that I use quite grown-up language, especially when discussing Nazis, so headphones are probably a good idea. If that sort of language offends you, I'm terribly sorry, but the exit is below. Lastly, if you do enjoy this, please do hit the like and subscribe buttons as appropriate, or leave me a comment below. It all helps the algorithm know that I'm here. Also, for those who are super keen, please note that I have a Patreon, which gives you access to my super secret Discord and allows you to get early previews of videos. And from my end, it allows me to buy more books. Right then, notices done. We're going to discuss one of the most important aerial victories of the war, and there are not many air battles which had a genuinely strategic impact, but this is very much one of them. Off the top of my head, things like the Battle of Britain stopped the Nazi invasion of Britain and made sure that Hitler went towards Russia much earlier than he'd planned to. The Battle of Midway, the defeat of the Imperial Japanese Navy, opened the path to victory in the Pacific for the Americans. Both were very dramatic and well documented. The victory that the combined bomber offensive of January and June 1944 won is far less well understood, but it was just as decisive, and it paved the way not just for the landings in Normandy, but also for the defeat of the Third Reich as a whole. And in a later episode, we will discuss the period from June 1944 to the end of the war and how they did that bit too. Today, though, we're going to focus on the first part, the run-up to Normandy. To understand how remarkable this victory really was, a little context is important, and so you may wish to go back to some of the preceding parts of this series, or not, as is your want. But to quickly summarise for those of you who are here now, like most campaigns, pre-war thinking was totally wrong in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Both struggled enormously with their initial operations and took horrific missteps and cock-ups, which, honestly, they paid for in blood. In 1942, it had been recognised by Bomber Command that it was really not coming close to stopping Germany, but Britain lacked many alternatives to hit back. Following the devastating Butt report into bombing accuracy, which showed that Bomber Command stood the same kinds of chances of hitting something as a blindfolded drunk put in a ring with Muhammad Ali and his pomp, changes were needed. Aside from massive investment in technical aids, Sir Charles Portal had ordered Arthur Harris to open up an area bombing campaign with the explicit aim of disrupting German war production and breaking their morale. By 1943, the RAF was getting very, very good at area bombing, and it had the aircraft and manpower to burn German cities to the ground on a regular basis, but it was taking huge losses in the process and achieving far less than had been hoped. Despite an impressive PR campaign, the massive costs and limited impact of Harris's campaign were not being ignored by the Air Ministry, the War Cabinet, or indeed Churchill himself, and pressure was building for something to change. Pre-war, the US had developed a theory of precision daylight bombing as a means to attack and destroy the critical infrastructure that was thought to be required by a nation making war. By 1943, though, now under the leadership of Ira Aker, the United States 8th Air Force was still quite small, much smaller than Bomber Command, and not really hitting the right German targets at all. The first big US raids into Germany started in October, and between then and December 1943, the 8th Air Force suffered a series of catastrophic losses, which came close to, but did not quite, knock them out of the war. Morale was low, casualties were high, and effects on Germany were, unfortunately, basically nil. In Washington, the men in charge looked at what Harris was doing, smashing up large chunks of Germany in spectacular raids that burnt down whole cities, and then looked at the mounting casualties of 8th Air Force and came to the conclusion that Ira Aker had failed. Which he kind of had. The scene was set then in January of 1944, with just 6 months to go before troops hit the beaches of Normandy for a potential cock-up on a monumental scale. Hence Eisenhower's insistence that both commands get on with the job at hand and focus on breaking the Luftwaffe and not trying to break Germany as a whole. For those squaddies at the bottom of the ranks of His Majesty's Armed Forces, the arrival of someone with birdshit on their hat denotes not some unfortunate who's had an encounter with a flock of seagulls, but rather it means an individual of some superiority with a lot of gold braid on their hat. Squaddies are always respectful like that. In the opening phase of January 1944, an awful lot of Americans with an awful lot of birdshit on their hats were about to find themselves in new jobs. Hap Arnold, overall commander of the United States Army Air Forces, had decided that the time had come to shuffle both the people and the structure of his command in Europe. First, he created a new post, that is the Theatre Commander Europe, to which he appointed Karl Spaatz. Karl had been in the Mediterranean until this point and had commanded the 8th Air Force back in 1942, so he was a well-respected figure and an effective leader who could get things done. Better still, he knew Arthur Tedder and indeed Arthur Harris and got on well with both. Spaatz and Arnold then conducted what the British Army refers to as a meeting without coffee with Ira Aker. Personally, I would have ordered him to fly an indefinite tour until he was killed or captured, but instead, after a great deal of unseemly moaning and begging, Aker was sent to the Mediterranean. That opened up command of the 8th Air Force to a new broom, to which they appointed Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle was probably the outstanding commander of the United States Army Air Forces in World War II, and a hugely impressive figure. I'm a bit of a fanboy, so forgive me, I'm going to froth for a few minutes here. Pre-war, Doolittle had flown across the United States in 21 hours and won a DFC in the process. He'd done the world's first instrument-only takeoff and landing, which sounds pretty impressive in and of itself, and then you learned that he did it using instruments that he'd designed. He decided that airmen and engineers needed to be able to talk a common language, and so in 1923 he went to MIT to go and get a degree in aeronautics. Having given himself 2 years to get it, he passed it in 1 and thought he'd better press on, and so he gained a doctorate in 1924. In 1925 he won the world's most prestigious and hardest-fought speed contest, the Schneider Cup, and performed the world's first outside loop, a manoeuvre that up to that point had been considered to be fatal due to the negative G-forces. And as if that wasn't enough, during his time with Shell Oil in the 1930s, he developed and sold 100-octane fuels to the United States and British governments, a fact which transformed both of their performance of their respective fighters. After Pearl Harbor, he'd pushed for and organised and flown on a revenge raid on Japan by carrier-borne B-25s. And just in case you don't understand quite what I mean by that, he took perfectly good land-based twin-engine bombers, stripped absolutely everything out of them that wasn't bolted down, including guns and armour, and asked the Navy to lend him one of their now very rare carriers to go and try and fly them off. Remarkably, rather than sending him to a psychologist, the Navy said, "OK, fine." And against all common sense and reason, instead of crashing straight into the sea and dying as logic dictated, he actually made it work. We'll do the Doolittle raid sometime. It's a wild, wild story, but I digress. Having got back from China, Doolittle was given the Medal of Honor and dispatched to the Mediterranean to command 12th Tactical Air Forces under Karl Spaatz, and then to act as a theatre commander for the Mediterranean, where he became the commanding officer of one Arthur Tedder. When Spaatz tapped him on the shoulder for command of the 8th Air Force in January of 1944, he was still technically a reservist. OK, back to England in January 1944. What's the state of play? We've used a bit of a framework up until this point a number of times to see how effective a bomber campaign might be. So let's see how our friend Ira Aker had fared compared to the hard thrasher methodology for fighting an air war. Well, that's not good enough, is it, really? I mean, look, he had a clear idea of what he was going to go and try and hit, but he was really wrong about why that mattered, because a lot of it didn't. He had an aircraft in the B-17 with a reasonable kind of range, but it certainly couldn't reach across the whole of Germany, and it definitely didn't have the survivability that it needed. He had not got, nor did he really come close to getting air superiority, even tactically, and he didn't really understand how to use his fighters properly to get it. More often than not, he couldn't actually hit the targets because of that bomb sight, and unlike the RAF, the USAAF had never developed different kinds of bombs for hardened targets, meaning that often even if they did make contact with it, they only damaged it and they didn't destroy it. And when it was all going sideways, there was no plan B. Look, a short digression here. In 1974, Muhammad Ali was past his prime as a boxer, but he wanted to have one last world title fight against his old nemesis, George Foreman. To win against the hard-hitting Foreman, Ali created a tactic which at the time was referred to as rope-a-dope, whereby he'd use the ring's ropes, absorb whatever Foreman could throw at him, and when his opponent tried to punch, occasionally he would punch back. It was a brutally effective but attritional tactic that saw Ali walk away from the ring with the belt, but also saw him walk away with long-term brain damage. 30 years before the Rumble in the Jungle, Jimmy Doolittle proposed to do something incredibly similar in the air war. His plan essentially was to get the Luftwaffe to start throwing punches with their fighter force and let his fighters counterattack. He'd bleed in the ring, sure, and he'd lose plenty of bombers, and probably a few fighters into the process, but he reckoned the USAAF would be able to stay in the fight and absorb the losses far better than the Luftwaffe. To do this, he firstly needed to increase the size of his command. On a given day, he might still lose 60 or 70 planes, but it would be quite a different thing to lose that from, say, a force of 300 rather than a force of 700. Targeting things wasn't that important per se. Trying to pick out this or that industry didn't particularly matter. What he wanted was things that the Luftwaffe were going to be forced to defend. So things like oil plants and engine factories and tank plants and airframe plants and steelworks, and in time, Berlin itself, were all perfectly legitimate and equally legitimate in this plan. A bit like a training montage in a Rocky movie, Doolittle and Spaatz prepared the ground well. They had both studied the Battle of Britain carefully, and they'd taken time to go and speak to the RAF's fighter commanders of 1940, Dowding and Park, to really understand how the RAF had defeated the Luftwaffe. The question the Germans had faced then, and the United States Army Air Forces face now, was, who do you select to die first? If you forced your fighters to stick close to the bombers, they'd lose all of their advantages of speed and height and manoeuvrability, and inevitably they'd pay for that with their lives. But it made the bombers feel like they were more protected. If, on the other hand, you let them roam ahead, they could potentially be far more effective, able to intercept fighter formations well over the horizon and inflict far more damage, but it would leave the bombers exposed to threats the fighters didn't see, and sooner or later the Luftwaffe would slip into the gap and rip the bomber formations apart. In Doolittle's mind, there was no contest. He proposed to set his fighters free. The story goes that on his first day in charge, Doolittle went to go and see Bill Kempner, the head of the 8th Air Force Fighter Command. Meeting in Kempner's office, Doolittle saw a sign that read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." "Bill," he said, "take that fucking sign down and put another one up that says, the first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to kill the enemy." As with most things, it's fairly easy to say these things out loud. It's a whole other thing to actually put them into practice. I, for example, have a perfect grasp in theory of sitting on a horse as it gallops along, but it turns out actually doing that involves crushing one's knackers and falling off a lot, much to the amusement of her ladyship. The Luftwaffe squadrons had by this point got their response to the United States Army Air Force raids down to a fine art. On warning of an impending raid, they would immediately scramble every serviceable aircraft they could to a nearby forming up point before climbing to attack the bomber stream. And this took time, anywhere from 15 minutes to as much as half an hour, during which they were scattered and vulnerable to being bounced, that is, to be ambushed, by US fighters, but only if they could be located. Neither fighters nor bombers at this point in the war could carry radar capable of picking up the enemy at any kind of a range. So Doolittle and Kempner asked for the help of the RAF's listening service, known as the Y service. Now, the operators of the Y service could detect Luftwaffe radio traffic and teleprinter traffic and direct United States fighters to intercept. This became a fantastically effective tactic. The RAF and the USAAF would hone it over time to annihilate Luftwaffe formations before they'd even have a chance of getting anywhere near damaging the bombers. There were basically 3 escort fighters available to the 8th Air Force in January of 1944. The P-47 Thunderbolt, known as the Jug, which had been in theatre for a while now. The P-38, which had never really been deployed in any great numbers as it had been distracted down into the Mediterranean. And the P-51D Mustang, which was just coming on stream. There are some people who question whether or not the P-51D was the best fighter in Europe, or whether the P-47 was actually a better aircraft overall, crippled by various political bits of infighting. But in my mind, there is simply no contest. The P-51 was the outstanding fighter escort of the war, and the statistics back that up. In the first 3 months of operations, Mustangs scored 3 times more kills per sortie than the P-47 in the same period, and twice as many as the P-38. Such was their ease of use, forgiving handling characteristics, reliability, cost, performance and speed of production, that by the end of 1944 every single fighter group in the 8th Air Force, bar one, had moved to the Mustang. I know that there is a certain well-regarded YouTuber who's done like 9 hours on the joys of the P-47, and I'd encourage everybody to watch it, but I'm afraid for me the P-51 still wins in escort duties hands down. Right, anyway, always leave the audience wanting more, as they say. Enough on the pony, back to the story. I've alluded to this a couple of times, but Harris's adherence to his own pet theory about how to win the war was no less fanatical than Eaker's had been to precision bombing. It will therefore come as absolutely no surprise whatsoever to hear at the start of 1944 he was still being a complete plonker. For those who've watched before, you'll know that in January 1943 at the Casablanca Conference, the Allies came up with what was supposed to be a combined bomber operations doctrine for the war, but what it actually really amounted to was a mealy-mouthed document that gave both Harris and Eaker basically a carte blanche to keep doing what they were doing separately. And then in July 1943, both of them been told quite politely to get the fuck on with it because destroying the Luftwaffe was going to be vital before the invasion occurred in May of 1944. And once again, they both looked at it and gone, excellent, well, I'm already doing all of that. So by January of 1944, with Eisenhower now threatening to quit, it had become quite clear that Portal really had lost whatever control he might once have had over his overmighty subordinate Arthur Harris. However, there were forces arrayed against Harris that perhaps he hadn't entirely understood, specifically the Air Ministry, the War Cabinet, and behind all of those, Arthur Tedder. Look, I've mentioned Tedder a couple of times. It's probably worth just taking a moment to acknowledge the man who would shortly become the most important officer in the RAF. A proudly fierce Scot, the same age as Eisenhower, both of them were born in 1890, he was a superb communicator, a great diplomat, and a fearsome warrior. Tedder fought in some of the grubbiest and hardest campaigns of the RAF in North Africa and the Mediterranean, where he'd proved to be a flexible, hard-working, and effective leader and strategist with a firm grasp on the essentials of key operations. Crucially, this had involved working hand-in-glove with Eisenhower, Patton, Mark Clark, and a host of other commanders who would later be involved in Overlord and the Land Campaign in Europe. He was fanatically focused not on nationality, not on branch of service, but on winning the fucking war, and this made him absolutely loved by some and hated by others. Eisenhower was very much in the love camp. He said that there were two outstanding commanders in the Mediterranean. One was Admiral Cunningham, who we'll cover another day, and the other was Arthur Tedder. When in mid-1943 it had looked like US Chief of Staff George Marshall would be appointed to command the Normandy invasion, Eisenhower had gone to go and tell him specifically to take Tedder on as his deputy. When Roosevelt unexpectedly picked Eisenhower instead, there really had been no choice in Ike's mind as to who he'd like to have at his right hand. Tedder had built up over a period of years a network of patronage and of friendship across the British and United States armies, across both the navies and across both the air forces. Unlike Harris, who was bullheaded and personally awkward as a man, and who didn't really understand how others ticked, Tedder had an easy charm and a wit and a mind as sharp as a rapier. In January of 1944, Harris was in the way of Tedder getting a job done, and he didn't stand a fucking chance. Using the clout of his post, his network, and his formal and informal arrangements, he managed to get Harris stripped of his right to decide on which bomber targets Bomber Command would be taking on, having instead to formally apply to the Ministry for Economic Warfare to deviate from a pre-prescribed list, a list supplied and updated by Arthur Tedder. A less self-assured and perhaps more politically astute man than Harris might have resigned at this point. Indeed, I can't help but escape the idea that perhaps Charles Portal rather hoped that he would. But instead, Harris did what he'd always done when he was presented with a fait accompli. He simply rolled with the punch and got on with executing his new orders. From now on, he was going to be Tedder's puppet. In fact, an argument can be made that for the rest of the war, directly or indirectly, Tedder ran the RAF, not Charles Portal. Tedder decided to use his new strategic bombing force control to hit some targets consecutively. That is, he wanted to hit certain targets at night with the RAF and then follow that up by day with the USAAF. This would wear down the defences, who might be firing for 10, 15 or maybe 20 hours at a time, and help force the Luftwaffe fighters up by day. For the first time, the phrase combined bomber offensive actually had some combined strategy behind it. And they put this double punch principle into practice for the first time on the night of the 24th, 25th of February 44 over that bogey target Schweinfurt, and it was spectacularly successful. On the night of the 24th, some 730 RAF heavy bombers attacked, followed by day by 276 from the 8th Air Force. In the 1943 attacks on Schweinfurt, the US forces had lost some 30% of their attacking forces. 79 B-17s were destroyed, along with nearly 900 men. On this mission on the 24th of February, just a few months later, a mere 11 B-17s were shot down and one fighter. The contrast was an ominous sign for Germany. Further, under Tedder's control, Harris had to use half of his bomber forces to hit what he would have considered to be panacea targets, i.e. to do something other than area bombing. He complained continually that his forces couldn't hit things like rail yards or oil plants or, from June, the V-1 launch sites. And yet time after time, Bomber Command found and hit these targets with pinpoint precision. As another author puts it rather nicely, Harris was being embarrassed by the virtuosity of his crews, and he would continue to be embarrassed for the duration of the war. All right, look, we're going to attempt an analogy here, so bear with me. Back in what I like to think of as the good old days, a chap seeking excitement went off to India to go and hunt tigers. Armed only with a high-powered rifle, 200 or 300 locals, a packing case of Darjeeling tea, and some highly inbred jeans, a gentleman could bag himself a new rug to put in front of the fireplace back in Blighty in no time at all. This is why there aren't many tigers left in India, and elephants have an instinctive dislike of the sound of a boiling kettle. Sometimes, though, a chap by now suffering from gout, malaria, dysentery, the clap, and a galloping sense of entitlement would find the whole riding on an elephant bit too much. Instead, he'd want to sit in a nice, comfortable treehouse where the tiger could be forced to come to him. Therefore, some poor long-suffering local smallholder would be persuaded to give up their family goat, which would then be tethered to a post in a clearing below said treehouse. And at some point in the next few days, our man up the tree, assuming he hadn't been bitten to death by swarms of mosquitoes, ants, or the judgment of future generations, would shoot said tiger. This was, for some reason that completely eludes me, considered to be great sport. Doolittle and his chums now propose to adopt a similar strategy for dealing with the Luftwaffe. Germans, of course, aren't tigers, and so far as I know, they prefer a bit of pork or a nice wurst to a goat, and, look, this analogy's got away from me a bit. Basically, the plan now was to use the B-17s as bait. They'd be pointed at a target that would then force the Luftwaffe to come up and fight. A combination of fighters and fighter bombers would then take the Luftwaffe on in the air or on the ground and destroy them. And this is what I like to think of as the tethered goat strategy. See, I got there in the end. Anyway, back in November, after those losses at Schweinfurt and Stuttgart, Eger and Frederick Anderson, the commander of 8th Air Force Bomber Command, had been working on a plan that they called Operation Argument. And this called for a series of deep penetration strikes into Germany to hit the Luftwaffe production factories. At the time, with no escorts available to go that far, Anderson had expected to lose perhaps as many as 7,000 men in a matter of days. For context, that's roughly 30% of the total dead of the US Marine Corps during its island-hopping campaign in the entirety of the Pacific War. But then the weather had closed in and Eger had got the sack. Now, Spaatz, Doolittle, Anderson and Kempner came together and dusted off the plan. The delays in December and January might have sent some in Washington absolutely nuts because of the apparent inaction of the 8th Air Force, but this delay was in fact a godsend. More than 300 P-51Ds arrived in England during that time and were made operational in time to begin the offensive, which radically changed the nature of the plan from being one that said, let's go and hit the plants and hopefully shoot down the fighters, to let's go and shoot down the fighters and hopefully hit the plants. Nevertheless, although this revised plan had more escorts, Anderson still reckoned he might lose anywhere between 200 and 300 bombers. That's 2,000 to 3,000 men on the first day alone. As the aim here was to hit the Luftwaffe factories, once the operation started, it did need to be pursued relentlessly and quickly, without pause, to stop the Germans from dispersing their production as they'd done with ball bearings in Schweinfurt. And that meant that the 8th Air Force needed 4 days of clear weather as a minimum. Every now and again you meet someone who, is just a bit weird, like nice enough, but, well, what my dear old mum might call a not right. If you're unfortunate to come across someone like that in a party or in a railway carriage or just walking down the street, the chances are that they will attempt to engage you in conversation, and as they do so you will feel a dropping sensation in your stomach. They will inevitably and almost immediately start to move towards their particular pet subject. If you're lucky, it's the 19th century accounting rules for England and Wales and Scotland, or wide-gauge railways of the world or something. If you are unlucky, this is political theory or eugenics or their collection of fingernails. When Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force, he brought on one such individual, Caltech's head of the meteorological department, Irving Crick. Crick felt that by looking at weather records he'd be able to predict the future, and he also felt that literally everyone in the world should know what a genius he was. He'd look at sequences that repeated, say, 2 days of rain followed by strong winds that then led to a patch of clear weather, and then he'd use that to forward project them into the future. He must have been so much fun when you were trapped in a small English pub with nowhere to go. Anyway, Doolittle needed, of course, 4 days for his operation to work, and so he turned to Irving to try and provide it. And Irving duly did his research and came back like Moses from the mountain on the 18th of Feb to pronounce that from the 20th there would be 4 days of clear weather. Everyone else said he was a nut job. 3 other forecasters said he was plumb wrong, and recon flights on the morning of the 19th said that it was solid cloud all over Europe. Nonetheless, Irving was completely convinced, and Doolittle and Anderson stuck by their man. So on the 19th, they ordered the attacks to begin. Somehow, and goodness knows alone if it was genius or madness or dumb luck, the sky broke clear as the lumbering B-17s prepared to take off on the morning of the 20th, just as Irving had said that they would. And this was great news for the 8th Air Force, but it was absolutely terrible news for anyone who ever met Crick thereafter for the rest of his life. A slight aside here, Crick would very nearly go down as the man that sank the whole of the D-Day landing forces by insisting that the weather would be clear on the 5th of June 1944, which, had his forecast been followed, would have resulted in the invasion force being launched into the teeth of a giant gale in the Channel. I digress. On the morning of the 20th of February 1944, 11,000 men flew towards Germany, whilst Spaatz and Doolittle, Anderson and Kempner waited for news. As the minutes ticked by, all of them must have realised that if this went wrong, if the 8th suffered another catastrophe like they had over Schweinfurt or Stuttgart, there was no telling what might happen. They might have to switch to night operations or stop entirely. If, on the other hand, this worked, it could be the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. That evening, reports started to come in from US bases across East Anglia. Anderson had not lost 2,000 men, he'd lost just 200. 21 B-17s had gone down, and the fighters were claiming that they had destroyed 198 and a further 50 probables. In reality, they'd shot down 153 Luftwaffe aircraft, a remarkable tally. Over the subsequent days, the 8th went back and back and back, and the Germans got wise to some of their tactics, proportionally increasing the 8th's losses and reducing the impact, but nonetheless, this was a crippling blow to Germany and one from which they never recovered. Over the next few days, losses amongst the bombers were high, around 6% for the US and around 6.6% for the RAF, but they had a material impact on the enemy, probably for the first time in the war. The Luftwaffe lost some 30% of its frontline strength on the air or in the ground. Nearly 1 in 5 of their pilots were killed in just 6 days, and fighter production was pushed back more than 2 months. The Luftwaffe's morale began to crack. As predicted, Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and Munitions, did try to disperse his manufacturing as fast as he could, but he was not quick enough. And even when he'd done so, this added 20% to his labour costs and made his production capability completely dependent on rail transport, something which would prove totally fatal in a couple of months' time. Moreover, attacks on oil production by both the RAF and the USAAF began in earnest now, and they would, by July, cripple German flight training, and by December would cripple German flying full stop. As an encore, Doolittle decided to go for Berlin. No diversionary raids, no messing about, just a straight line there and back. The Germans would know that they were coming, and that was the point. And so on the 4th of March, the 8th Air Force took off for their first deep raid into Berlin, and it all went horribly wrong because once again the weather played silly buggers. About half the force couldn't even find the city, and the rest claimed to have bombed something through the clouds, but it was confused and indecisive. So Doolittle sent them again, right back into it on the 6th of March. Same route, same timings, but this time an even bigger force. Some 814 bombers and 943 fighters set out. The Luftwaffe was properly ready for them, and they'd managed to pull together some 1,024 fighters to come and oppose them. This was Bloody Monday. The largest air battle that the world had ever seen opened up, with the skies filled with bombers and fighters. In reality, the bomber force was really too big to be controlled. The 1st Division got a navigational error and drifted too far south. The 2nd Division was flying some B-24s and got separated from the 1st. And the 3rd Division got their course absolutely correct, but as a result of all the fighters being with the 1st Division, they didn't have any fighter cover. The results were completely devastating. The 100th Bombardment Group lost 15 out of 16 aircraft, for example. 70% of all bombers came home with damage. Almost no bombers got to Berlin, never mind their targets. And the Germans lost 160 fighters destroyed, including 4 Experten. Quite what the fucking hell the boys of the 8th thought then when 2 days later Doolittle ordered them back in again, but order them back in he did. Once again they set off, this time managing to keep in close contact with one another and inflicting heavy losses on the Luftwaffe, and they could see the big city and bombed it successfully. They must have thought they'd get the day off at least, or someplace to go, but on the 9th Doolittle ordered them again into Berlin. But something had changed on the 9th. The Luftwaffe did not come up. It couldn't. Its pilots were exhausted, its fuel was expended, and its planes were half broken. If this was a boxing match, the Luftwaffe wasn't sprawled out on the canvas just yet, but they were on one knee and taking a count. Just 6 B-17s and 1 fighter were lost, and it marked the first time that the Luftwaffe failed to seriously contest a raid, and a turning point in the bomber war. And on the ground, unbeknownst to the boys flying overhead, was Hermann Göring. He later said that when he'd seen the stream of over 1,000 enemy aircraft, including fighters, flowing over Berlin in broad daylight unopposed, he knew that the war was over. And so did a great many German citizens. In March and April, the combined losses for the 8th and 15th Air Forces would top out at over 628 bombers lost, that is 6,280 men dead or captured, and an unknown number of wounded besides. But the reality is, despite these horrific losses, they kept plugging away, each and every time they got back into their aircraft and they flew the next mission. In May, 8th Air Force losses halved, and crews began to realise that they were contributing to one of the most remarkable victories in air warfare of all time. On the 9th of May 1944, patrolling P-51Ds flew deep into Germany, and their opening engagement with German fighters was some 500 miles from the beaches at Normandy. Suddenly, they realised the Luftwaffe had pulled almost entirely out of France, and as this realisation dawned, it opened up an opportunity to start doing the serious work of preparation for the invasion on the ground. This meant that the tactical air forces could go in and take out things like radar stations and early warning systems and rail networks and bridges and oil depots and the multitude of other critical infrastructure. The Luftwaffe had suffered a strategic defeat. In April alone, they lost twice as many planes as they had lost in the entirety of 1942 and 43 combined. By June, they'd lost 1,000 experienced flyers and over 3,000 aircraft. You and I both know what happened on the 6th of June 1944. Eisenhower's pre-invasion instructions to his troops simply said, "If you see any aircraft in the sky over the beaches, it's one of ours." In all, the US Army Air Forces in Europe had lost 2,600 bombers and 980 fighters in the preceding 5 months and taken some 18,000 casualties in the process, 3 times more than the land forces would take pushing the beaches on D-Day. During the breakout from Normandy, both the RAF and the USAAF would lose 8,500 men each. But break out they would, and in the next phase the question was how to use this victory to maximum effect. And so that is where we will come to next time. Well, thank you. If you've made it this far and watched the whole video, you really are something quite special and you deserve a treat. So please do retire to your nearest approved convenience store, off-licence or pantry and select yourself something sweet as a reward. I will admit that this was considerably harder to pull together than I'd anticipated, and this is now my fourth attempt to actually record the narrative, so I hope you've enjoyed it and it's made some kind of sense. For the Allies, the story from here will be one of victory, not quickly, not without cost, but victory nonetheless, and I plan to start trying to tell that story in the next couple of months. I need to do a little bit of further reading around the subject, and I want to try and pull some threads together that make some kind of sense. I also need to get through Richard Davies' magnus opus, Karl Spaatz and the European War, a book that I only took delivery of the other day, and I kind of wish I'd had at the beginning. It's absolutely enormous, so bear with me, I've got to get that done. If this has pleased you, then please do hit the like and subscribe button and consider putting a comment below, ideally one that does not insult my mother or question my sanity. If you've really enjoyed this and you want to help me, then please do me a favour and sign up for my Patreon. For now then, ladies and gents, and everyone in between, have a very lovely day.